Caroline Levitt sat alone in her dimly lit office, the harsh glow of her phone screen reflecting off the dark mahogany desk. The notifications were endless: emails, voicemails, text messages. Headlines from across the political spectrum screamed outrage over the Supreme Court's latest ruling. Supreme Court forces $2 billion in foreign aid, betrayal at the highest levels. Her staff had stopped filtering the messages. It was impossible to keep up. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were furious. Veterans, single mothers, struggling small business owners, all of them outraged that billions of their hard-earned tax dollars were being funneled overseas while inflation was skyrocketing. Healthcare was collapsing, and families were barely scraping by. Caroline picked up her phone and scrolled through the messages. One voicemail caught her attention, the shaky voice of an elderly woman. "Congresswoman Levitt, please. My husband served this country for 35 years. He needs medication, but Medicare won't cover it anymore. We've lost our savings, and now they're sending money to foreign governments? Please, help us." Caroline's chest tightened. She closed her eyes for a moment, then leaned back in her chair. A soft knock at the door. "Come in," she said. It was David Hunt, her chief of staff, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and the weathered look of someone who had survived more than his share of political wars. He carried a folder in one hand and his phone in the other. "They're expecting a statement," David said. "I know." Caroline's voice was flat. "I'm still deciding what to say." David hesitated, then crossed the room and placed the folder in front of her. "You might want to take a look at this first." She opened it, a detailed breakdown of the Supreme Court decision. It wasn't just that the court had ruled to force the release of $2 billion in foreign aid, it was the way it had happened. A single lower court judge, Amir Ali, had issued an injunction that started the chain of events. And shockingly, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a conservative appointed by President Trump, had sided with the liberal justices to uphold the decision. Caroline's eyes narrowed. "Barrett?" David nodded. She crossed the line. Caroline's jaw clenched. Amy Barrett had been a symbol of conservative hope. Her appointment was one of Trump's defining victories. And now she had turned her back on them? "And Amir Ali?" Caroline asked. David's expression darkened. "Federal judge, appointed by Biden in 2023. Born in Canada, became a U.S. citizen in 2019. No judicial history on foreign policy. Yet somehow he managed to dictate the spending of billions in taxpayer dollars." Caroline's pulse quickened. "And no one stopped him?" David shook his head. "The lower court ruling was appealed. It went to the Supreme Court. And Barrett sided with the liberals." Caroline closed the folder, her hand tightening on the edge of the desk. "I need to say something," she said. David's brow furrowed. "You'll be stepping into dangerous territory." Caroline stood, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she walked toward the window. Outside, the Capitol dome gleamed under the evening sky. "They betrayed us," Caroline said quietly. "All of them. The people deserve to know." David hesitated. "If you go after Barrett, if you go after Ali, you won't just be taking on the court. You'll be taking on the entire system." Caroline's gaze sharpened. "Good." David smiled faintly. "I'll set up the hearing." Caroline turned from the window, fire in her eyes. "Make sure it's televised." Later that night, Caroline sat alone in her apartment, flipping through the files David had given her. The anger in her chest was cold now, calculated. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, about who held it. She picked up her phone and made one last call before bed. The line clicked. "Madam Congresswoman," a familiar voice said on the other end. "Mr. President," Caroline replied. Trump's voice was sharp. "I assume you've seen the news." "I've seen it. I'm advising you to stay out of it," Trump said. "You don't win by attacking the court." Caroline's fingers curled around the phone. "With respect, Mr. President, I'm not interested in winning." Trump's voice lowered. "Then what are you interested in?" Caroline's gaze hardened. "Justice." A long silence. "Be careful, Levitt," Trump said. "You'll make powerful enemies." Caroline's lips curled into a cold smile. "Good." She ended the call, stood, and walked to the window. Tomorrow would be the beginning of a war. And Caroline Levitt was ready for it. The hearing room was packed. Reporters, lawmakers, and spectators filled every available seat. The low hum of conversation hanging in the air like static electricity. Camera crews positioned themselves at strategic angles, their red lights blinking as they waited for the main event. Caroline Leavitt stood behind the heavy wooden doors of the hearing room, her heart steady despite the building tension. David Hunt stood beside her, his gaze sharp and calculating. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Caroline adjusted the cuff of her blazer and exhaled slowly. "If I'm not sure now, I'll never be." David hesitated. "You know they'll come after you." Caroline's lips curled slightly. "Let them try." A congressional aide opened the doors, and the low murmur of conversation swelled into a buzz of anticipation. All eyes turned toward her as Caroline stepped into the room, the sharp click of her heels cutting through the noise. The crowd quieted instantly. She walked to the table at the center of the room, the official congressional seal emblazoned in gold on the front. Her gaze swept across the room, senators and representatives seated in the semicircle of power, their expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. And there he was. Amir Ali sat at the witness table, dressed in a crisp navy suit, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His expression was cool, detached, a mask of unshakable confidence. Caroline settled into her seat, her gaze locked on his. "Good afternoon, Judge Ali," she said evenly. Amir inclined his head slightly. Congresswoman Leavitt, Senator Raymond Cooper, chairing the hearing, tapped his gavel. "This hearing will come to order." The room fell silent. Caroline leaned forward. "Judge Ali, let's not waste time. You issued an injunction that led directly to the Supreme Court's decision to force the release of $2 billion in foreign aid, taxpayer money. Let's start with a simple question. Why?" Amir's gaze was steady. The executive order issued by President Trump to freeze foreign aid was in direct violation of established congressional authority. The Constitution vests the power of the purse in Congress, not the executive branch. My decision was based entirely on legal precedent. Caroline's eyes narrowed. "Legal precedent? Is that what you call overriding the will of the American people?" Amir's brow lifted slightly. "I call it upholding the Constitution." Caroline's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Funny, I don't recall the Constitution saying that unelected federal judges get to decide how our tax dollars are spent." Amir's expression remained calm. "My authority comes from the appointment confirmed by the United States Senate." "Right." Caroline's tone sharpened. "But you weren't elected by the American people, were you?" A ripple of discomfort ran through the room. A few senators shifted in their seats. Amir's jaw tightened. "That's not how the judicial system works, Congresswoman. And that's the problem, isn't it?" Caroline's voice cut through the room like a blade. "A single unelected judge, born in Canada, granted U.S. citizenship just 4 years ago, now holds the power to override the sitting president of the United States." Amir's eyes darkened slightly. "I have served this country faithfully and with integrity. My birthplace is irrelevant, is it?" Caroline's voice was like ice. "Because I can assure you, to the American families wondering why their tax dollars are going overseas instead of funding schools or veterans care, it's very relevant." David shot her a quick look, careful. Amir adjusted the microphone. "Congresswoman, the Constitution guarantees separation of powers. The executive branch cannot unilaterally override congressionally approved spending. My ruling was consistent with established law." Caroline's gaze sharpened. "Law written by politicians who are bought and paid for by foreign lobbyists." Amir's eyes flashed. "I am not influenced by foreign powers." "Really?" Caroline opened a folder and held up a document. "Because according to financial disclosures, a lobbying firm representing multiple foreign governments made a direct donation to your confirmation committee 2 weeks before your appointment." A murmur of shock swept through the room. Amir's jaw tightened. That contribution was within legal guidelines and reported according to transparency laws. "Legal doesn't mean ethical, Judge Ali," Caroline said, "and it sure as hell doesn't mean right." Amir's eyes darkened. "If you're suggesting that my ruling was influenced by..." "I'm not suggesting anything." Caroline's voice sharpened. "I'm stating it outright." Amir's mask slipped for half a second, a flicker of something beneath the calm exterior. Caroline pressed forward. "You took money from foreign-backed lobbyists. You handed down a ruling that directly benefits foreign governments at the expense of the American taxpayer. That's not just unethical, that's a betrayal." Amir leaned forward slightly. Congresswoman, my decision was not about foreign interests. It was about the rule of law. Caroline's eyes narrowed. Then tell me something. Judge Ali, when you made this ruling, did you consider the harm it would cause to the American families already struggling to survive? Amir didn't answer. Caroline's gaze sharpened. That's what I thought. A senator from the opposing side, Senator Craig Holloway, interrupted. Point of order. Congresswoman Levitt is implying wrongdoing without evidence. Caroline didn't blink. The evidence is right in front of us. Follow the money. Holloway scoffed. This is a circus. Caroline turned toward him, her eyes cold. No, Senator. What's happening in this chamber? What happened in that courtroom? That's the real circus. Amir's expression hardened. Are you accusing me of treason? Congresswoman? Caroline's gaze burned into his. I'm accusing you of selling out the American people. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, cameras flashing. Senator Cooper slammed the gavel. Order, order. Amir leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold. You're walking a dangerous line. Congresswoman. Caroline's expression didn't change, and you've already crossed it. The hearing was called into recess. But the damage was already done. As Caroline stood to leave, David leaned toward her. You pushed too hard. No, Caroline said quietly as she gathered her papers. I pushed exactly hard enough. From across the room, Amir watched her with a calculating expression. Caroline met his gaze, unflinching. This was only the beginning. Caroline Levitt sat at the head of the long conference table, the polished glass surface reflecting the dim overhead lights. The room was cold, not from the temperature, but from the atmosphere. Every figure seated around her was a player in Washington's brutal political chess game. Senators, party leaders, senior strategists, all of them waiting, watching. David Hunt stood at the far end of the table, his arms crossed, his gaze shifted between Caroline and the others, calculating the mood like a battlefield general assessing the enemy's strength. That, Senator Thomas Vance said, leaning forward, was reckless. Caroline's gaze sharpened. It was necessary. Necessary? Vance's voice was sharp. You accused a sitting federal judge of corruption on live television. Caroline's eyes narrowed. Because he's guilty. Vance's lips curled in a thin smile. Do you have proof? Caroline reached into her folder, pulled out the financial documents David had given her, and slid them across the table. Right there, a direct financial link between Amir Ali and a lobbying firm tied to foreign governments. He ruled on a case that directly benefited those governments. That's more than just suspicious. Vance barely glanced at the papers. You don't understand how dangerous this is. Caroline, I understand perfectly. No, you don't. Vance's tone sharpened. Amir Ali isn't just some federal judge. He's protected. His appointment was strategic. Caroline's eyes narrowed. Protected by who? Vance's gaze flicked toward David. David hesitated before stepping forward. Judge Ali's appointment wasn't an accident. David said, the lobbying firm that backed his confirmation isn't just any firm. It's tied to foreign defense contractors, companies with deep connections in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Caroline's jaw tightened. And Congress approved him? Unanimously. Vance's expression darkened, including the Republicans. Caroline's eyes flashed. Why? Because they didn't know what he was. Vance leaned back, his fingers tapping against the table. Judge Ali was handpicked, not for his judicial expertise, but because he could be controlled. Caroline's chest tightened. Controlled by who? Vance's gaze sharpened. The same people who pushed this foreign aid package through Congress in the first place. Caroline's mind spun. This isn't about the aid, is it? David's eyes darkened. No, it's about control. The aid package was a test, a way to see how much power they could wield through the courts. And it worked. Caroline shook her head slowly. And Barrett? Why would she side with them? Vance's smile was cold. You think judges operate without pressure? Barrett's been compromised, maybe not directly, but through influence. Caroline exhaled sharply. So this whole thing, the aid package, the ruling, Barrett's vote, it was engineered. David nodded. And now they know they can manipulate the court itself. That's the real danger. Caroline's fingers curled into a fist. Then we expose them. Vance's expression darkened. And what happens when the full weight of the establishment turns on you? You won't just be going up against Ali or Barrett. you'll be going up against the institutions of this country. Caroline's jaw tightened. I don't care. You should. Vance's gaze sharpened. Because they'll come for you. Politically, personally. And when they can't destroy your career, they'll come for your life. David's jaw tightened. He's right. Caroline's gaze hardened. Let them try. Caroline. Vance's tone was cold. This is suicide. Caroline stood, her chair scraping softly against the polished floor. She leaned forward, both hands pressed flat on the table. I don't care how powerful they are, she said quietly. They crossed a line, and now they'll answer for it. The room was silent. Vance's gaze was sharp. And what if Barrett is the one who stops you? Caroline's eyes narrowed. Then Barrett's part of the problem. David stepped forward. We need a strategy. I have one. Caroline's gaze sharpened. We follow the money. We expose the network. We make it clear to the American people that the Supreme Court is compromised. David's expression was grim. And then what? Then, Caroline's voice hardened. We tear it down. Later that night, Caroline sat alone in her apartment, a single desk lamp casting a pool of light across the cluttered papers in front of her. Her laptop screen glowed with open files, financial records, court transcripts, intelligence reports. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. She took a sip of whiskey, letting the burn settle in her chest. A soft knock at the door. She set the glass down carefully and reached for the drawer where she kept her Glock. Who is it? It's me. Caroline's hand relaxed. She opened the door, and Senator Craig Holloway stood on the other side. He was still in his suit, the top button of his shirt undone. His gaze was dark. You shouldn't be here, Caroline said. And yet, here I am. Holloway stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the papers on her desk. I saw the hearing. I'm sure you did. Caroline folded her arms. Are you here to threaten me or bribe me? Neither. Holloway's gaze sharpened. I'm here to warn you. About what? You think you've exposed something dangerous. Holloway stepped closer, his expression hard. But you haven't even scratched the surface. Caroline's eyes narrowed. Who's behind this? Holloway's gaze darkened. You're asking the wrong question. Then what's the right question? Holloway's voice was quiet. Why now? Caroline's gaze sharpened. What are you saying? Holloway's expression turned cold. Judge Alley wasn't the endgame. He was the opening move. A chill settled in Caroline's chest. Then what's the endgame? Holloway's gaze sharpened. Control. Of everything. Caroline's mind raced. You knew. I suspected. And you didn't stop it? Holloway's gaze darkened. Because I couldn't. Caroline's eyes burned. Then help me stop it. Holloway hesitated, then stepped closer. If I help you, there's no going back. Caroline's expression hardened. I'm not going back. Holloway's gaze darkened. Then let's start with Barrett. Caroline's breath quickened. What about her? Holloway's voice was sharp. Barrett didn't switch sides on her own. Caroline's gaze darkened. Then who's controlling her? Holloway's voice dropped to a near whisper. You already know the answer. The realization settled like a lead weight in Caroline's chest. Holloway stepped back. Good luck, Congresswoman. He turned toward the door. Wait. Caroline's voice was sharp. Holloway stopped. Who's next? Holloway's gaze was cold. If you're smart, you won't find out. He left without another word. Caroline's hands tightened into fists. It wasn't just about Barrett. It wasn't just about Allie. It was about the whole damn system. And Caroline Levitt was going to burn it to the ground. Caroline stepped out of the Capitol building, her heels striking the marble steps with sharp precision. The brisk evening air whipped through her hair, but the chill had nothing on the cold anger simmering beneath her skin. She pulled her coat tighter as David caught up with her, his breath visible in the crisp night air. You were right, he said. Caroline's eyes narrowed. About what? David handed her a thin manila folder. Barrett. Caroline's pulse quickened as she opened the folder beneath the dim glow of a streetlight. Inside were transcripts of meetings, phone calls, and unclassified financial statements. At the center of it all was Amy Coney Barrett, a justice who had once been the shining star of the conservative movement, meeting privately with foreign lobbyists linked to defense contractors. Caroline's jaw tightened. When were these taken? 2 months before the ruling. David replied. She met with senior officials from a foreign-backed lobbying firm in a private retreat outside of D.C. And David's voice darkened. 2 weeks after that meeting, Barrett's husband was appointed to the board of one of those companies. Caroline's breath stilled. That's bribery. David nodded. Not technically. The appointment was legal, but the timing is damning. Caroline's gaze hardened. David hesitated. Caroline, we're talking about a sitting Supreme Court justice. She's compromised, Caroline said flatly. David lowered his voice. And if you go after her, they'll close ranks. The court, the Senate, the White House. I don't care. Caroline's gaze was like steel. She sided with the liberals on a decision that betrayed the American people. If she's sold out, they deserve to know. David rubbed the back of his neck. Look, we need to be strategic about this. If we accuse Barrett directly, who said anything about accusing her? Caroline's lips curled into a thin smile. We expose her. David's brows lifted. How? Caroline's gaze sharpened. We make her come to us. That night, Caroline appeared on the most watched primetime news show in the country. The host, a polished and carefully controlled conservative pundit, welcomed her with his usual smug smile. Congresswoman Leavitt, the host said, I think I speak for a lot of Americans when I say we're still stunned by Justice Barrett's vote. So am I, Caroline replied smoothly. The host's brow lifted. You think something influenced her decision? I don't think, Caroline said. I know. The host leaned forward. And what exactly are you implying? Caroline's gaze was piercing. I'm not implying anything, but I would be very interested in knowing why Justice Barrett's husband suddenly secured a high-paying position on the board of a foreign-linked defense contractor, right after his wife ruled in favor of sending billions of American taxpayer dollars overseas. The host's eyes widened. That's a serious accusation. I'm not making accusations, Caroline said coolly. I'm asking questions. The American people deserve answers. The clip went viral within hours. Social media exploded with speculation. Barrett's name was trending worldwide. The next day, Caroline's office received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Barrett sitting at a private dinner, across from a man Caroline recognized as a senior executive for a foreign defense firm. There was no note, just a single line of text at the bottom of the photograph. Stop digging. Caroline stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone. David, she said, get me a meeting with Barrett. Amy Coney Barrett's office was a cathedral of quiet authority, all dark leather and muted lighting. The justice herself sat behind a mahogany desk, her expression composed as Caroline entered the room. Caroline took a seat across from her, crossing one leg over the other. Congresswoman, Barrett said smoothly, I assume you didn't request this meeting to discuss legal theory. Caroline's gaze was sharp. No, I came to discuss your betrayal. Barrett's eyes flashed with brief irritation before settling back into calm detachment. Careful, she said softly. Caroline leaned forward. You voted against your own principles. Against your own party. Why? Barrett's lips curled into a thin smile. You think this is about ideology? It's about power, Caroline replied coldly. Barrett's gaze sharpened. You have no idea how the game works. Then explain it to me. Barrett's smile faded. Do you know how fragile this country is? Caroline's eyes narrowed. What does that have to do with selling out to foreign interests? Barrett's gaze darkened. Because the alternative was collapse. You're saying you were protecting America? I'm saying I was protecting stability. Barrett's voice hardened. The system survives because it is controlled. That foreign aid? That was leverage. Economic power is political power, and without it, this country would crumble. Caroline's jaw tightened. So you sold out American taxpayers for stability? Barrett's gaze was cold. I maintained order. Caroline's expression hardened. And who gave you the authority to decide that? Barrett leaned back. You think you're different? I'm nothing like you. Barrett smiled faintly. Not yet. Caroline stood, her chair scraping softly against the polished floor. This isn't over, Caroline said. Barrett's gaze sharpened. Be careful, Congresswoman. Caroline's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You should take your own advice. She walked toward the door. Oh, and Congresswoman? Caroline stopped without turning. Next time. Barrett's voice was soft. You might want to reconsider whose side you're on. The system can be very unforgiving to those who try to burn it down. Caroline's eyes narrowed. Then I guess it's time to build a new one. She left without looking back. The car was waiting for Caroline when she stepped outside. David stood by the door, his face tight with concern. Well? He asked. She didn't deny it. Caroline said. David's expression darkened. What now? Caroline opened the car door. Now we see who makes the next move. They drove through the dark streets of D.C., the glow of city lights casting flickering shadows across the tinted windows. David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. Caroline? She turned toward him. It's the FBI, he said. They're opening an investigation into Barrett. Caroline's eyes widened. That was fast. David's brow furrowed. Too fast. Caroline's phone vibrated. A single text message. No name. No number. You should have listened. The car lurched as the driver swerved suddenly. Jesus! David shouted. A black SUV shot past them, cutting into their lane. The driver slammed the brakes, sending them skidding sideways. Caroline's pulse slammed in her ears as the SUV's tinted window lowered. A figure in a black mask leaned out. He raised a gun. Down! David shouted. Caroline threw herself down as the window exploded in a spray of glass and gunfire. The car swerved again, tires screeching as they hit the curb. The SUV disappeared into the night. David was breathing hard, a thin cut on his temple from the glass. Caroline's hand trembled as she picked up her phone from the floor. The screen was cracked. The text message was still there. Stop digging. Caroline's gaze hardened. They want me to stop, she said, her voice cold. David's eyes darkened. Are you going to? Caroline's gaze sharpened. Not a chance. The Oval Office was bathed in golden afternoon light. Heavy curtains framed the windows, and the American flag stood tall in the corner. Caroline Leavitt stood in the center of the room, facing the most powerful man in the country. President Donald Trump sat behind the resolute desk, his expression hard and calculating. His hands were clasped together, elbows resting on the polished wood surface. His gaze was sharp, assessing Caroline as if she were an opponent rather than an ally. Congresswoman Leavitt, Trump said, his voice low, you've been making noise. Caroline's chin lifted slightly. I'm getting results. Trump's lips curled faintly. Are you? Caroline's gaze sharpened. The FBI just opened an investigation into Barrett. The American people are finally paying attention. And you think that's a victory? Trump's gaze darkened. Caroline, you don't win by exposing the system. You win by controlling it. That's the problem, Caroline replied. The system isn't working for the American people anymore. Trump leaned back in his chair. And you think tearing it down will fix it? If it's corrupt? Caroline's gaze hardened. Yes. Trump's smile was cold. You sound naive. Caroline stepped closer. Do I? Trump's gaze sharpened. You think I don't know what Barrett is? You think I don't know how the court works? Then why didn't you stop it? Caroline's voice was cutting. Trump's jaw tightened. Because it wasn't the right time. Caroline's eyes flashed. And when exactly would the right time have been? After they've sold out the entire country? Trump's gaze hardened. Careful, Leavitt. Caroline's voice sharpened. You think I'm afraid of you? Trump's smile faded. You should be. Caroline stepped even closer, her eyes burning into his. No, Mr. President, they should be afraid of me. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Trump stood, walking around the desk until he was face to face with Caroline. He was taller than her, broader, but Caroline didn't back down. You don't win by attacking the court, Trump said quietly. You win by stacking it. Caroline's brow furrowed. Trump's gaze sharpened. The court bends when the pressure is strong enough. You just need to know where to apply it. And you think that's a long-term solution? Trump's expression darkened. There is no long-term solution. There's only control. Caroline's jaw tightened. And what happens when you lose control? Trump's smile was cold. Then you make sure no one else has it. Caroline shook her head. That's not democracy. Trump's eyes flashed. This stopped being a democracy a long time ago. Caroline's chest tightened. If that's true, then what are we fighting for? Trump's gaze was piercing. Power. Caroline's breath hitched. You have a choice, Caroline, Trump said. You can burn the system down, or you can take it over. Caroline's eyes narrowed. And what if I choose neither? Trump's gaze sharpened. Then you'll lose. And so will everyone who's counting on you. Caroline's fists curled at her sides. Then I guess I'll have to win. Trump's smile returned. We'll see. He extended his hand. Caroline stared at it for a moment, then turned and walked toward the door. Caroline. Trump's voice stopped her. She turned back. If you take this fight all the way, Trump said quietly, there's no going back. Caroline's gaze sharpened. I'm not going back. She walked out without another word. David was waiting for her outside the West Wing, leaning against one of the marble pillars. He straightened as she approached. Well? He asked. Caroline's expression was hard. He knows. David's brow furrowed. And? Caroline's gaze sharpened. And he's not going to stop it. David's mouth pressed into a thin line. Which means it's up to us. Caroline stepped toward him. We need leverage. David frowned. On Barrett? No. Caroline's eyes darkened. On the system. David's expression hardened. That's dangerous. Good. Caroline replied. David exhaled sharply. How do you plan to get leverage on the Supreme Court? Caroline's lips curled. By making them vulnerable. David's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? Barrett's decision wasn't just about the money. Caroline said. It was about control. If we can prove that the court was influenced by foreign money. David's eyes widened. It becomes a constitutional crisis. Exactly. Caroline's gaze sharpened. And once it becomes a crisis, we take it apart, piece by piece. David hesitated. Caroline, if you go down this road, you won't just be taking on Barrett. You'll be taking on the Chief Justice, the judiciary, the entire political establishment. I know. And if they fight back? Caroline's gaze was like steel. Then we fight harder. David's mouth pressed into a thin line. And how do we find proof? Caroline's smile was cold. We already have proof. David's brows lifted. Caroline pulled a flash drive from her jacket pocket and handed it to him. David's eyes darkened as he turned it over in his hand. What's on this? Financial transfers. Caroline's voice was calm. Tens of millions of dollars in dark money. Shell companies. Offshore accounts. All linked to the same lobbying firm that funded Barrett's husband's appointment. David's breath stilled. Where did you get this? Caroline's smile was thin. A friend. David's gaze sharpened. You know this will start a war, right? Caroline's expression didn't change. Good. David slipped the flash drive into his pocket. What now? Caroline's gaze darkened. Now, she said quietly, we go public. The press conference was held the next morning on the steps of the Capitol. The air was crisp, the sun gleaming off the marble columns behind Caroline as she stepped up to the podium. A sea of reporters stood in front of her, microphones aimed in her direction. David stood to her right, arms crossed, his expression hard. Caroline adjusted the microphone. My fellow Americans, she began, her voice calm and steady. The American people deserve the truth. She held up a document. This, she said, is evidence of financial manipulation at the highest levels of our judiciary. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Cameras clicked. This is proof that foreign-linked lobbying firms have compromised our Supreme Court. Caroline continued, and it goes beyond Amy Barrett. It goes all the way to the Chief Justice. Reporters shouted questions. Caroline's gaze hardened. The system is broken, she said, and it's time we fixed it. A single reporter called out, Congresswoman Leavitt, are you calling for the resignation of the Chief Justice? Caroline's gaze sharpened. I'm calling for a reckoning. She stepped back from the podium as the press exploded into chaos. David leaned toward her. They're going to hit back hard. Caroline's eyes burned. Let them. The SUV's headlights cut through the rainy darkness as it wound down the back streets of Washington. D.C. Caroline sat in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the blurred city lights streaking past the rain-slick windows. David sat beside her, his jaw tight, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't eased since the press conference. The fallout had been immediate and brutal. Headlines were screaming across every major news outlet. Leavitt accuses Supreme Court of corruption. Congresswoman Leavitt declares political war. Calls for resignation of the Chief Justice. The conservative establishment was imploding. The left was circling like vultures. And Caroline was standing directly in the crosshairs. David's phone buzzed again. He ignored it. That's the third call from the Speaker's office. He said, let them keep calling. Caroline replied, David's gaze hardened. They're threatening to pull your committee assignments. You'll lose political cover. Good, Caroline said coldly. Then I won't owe them anything. David exhaled sharply. Caroline, this is dangerous. They'll come after you. Caroline's gaze sharpened. They already have. David's phone buzzed again. He pulled it from his pocket, his expression darkening. It's Holloway, he said. Put him on speaker. David tapped the screen. Congresswoman. Holloway's voice was smooth, almost amused. I see you've made your move. You sound surprised. Caroline said. Not surprised. Holloway replied. Impressed. You don't sound worried. Holloway chuckled. You've made things interesting. I'll give you that. But you've also made a mistake. Caroline's jaw tightened. And what mistake would that be? You've underestimated how deep this goes. Holloway said. His tone darkened. This isn't just about Barrett. The people behind this. These are not men who accept losing. Then they'll be disappointed. Caroline replied coldly. A pause. Then Holloway's voice sharpened. Walk away, Caroline. Caroline's lips curled into a dangerous smile. Or what? You don't want to find out. I think I do. Holloway's voice dropped to a near whisper. You have no idea how far they're willing to go to keep control. Caroline's gaze darkened. Neither do they. Holloway exhaled slowly. Very well. I'll see you soon, Congresswoman. The line went dead. David tossed the phone onto the seat beside him. He's scared. Good, Caroline said. David's gaze sharpened. Or he's trying to bait you. Caroline's jaw tightened. Let him try. The SUV slowed as they approached a secure, undisclosed location. A government safehouse arranged after the first attempt on Caroline's life. The car came to a stop in the underground garage, and the driver stepped out to open the door. Caroline was halfway out of the car when David's phone buzzed again. David frowned and checked the screen. Caroline saw the tension in his face before he even spoke. It's the FBI, David said. His voice was strained. They're at your apartment. Caroline's blood went cold. Why? David's eyes darkened. They're executing a search warrant. Caroline's heart hammered. For what? David's gaze sharpened. For evidence of political bribery. Caroline's jaw tightened. They're setting me up. David nodded grimly. And they're doing it fast. Caroline's pulse surged with cold fury. Who signed the warrant? David's voice was hard. Judge Amir Ali. Caroline stormed into the safehouse, her heels striking the concrete floor with sharp precision. David followed closely behind, his phone pressed to his ear. They've already sealed the apartment, David said. The warrant was pushed through hours ago. Caroline's hands curled into fists. He's trying to turn this on me. They're going to claim the financial transfers you released were illegally obtained. David said. They'll accuse you of colluding with outside forces to undermine the Supreme Court. Caroline's eyes flashed. That's absurd. David's gaze darkened. That's politics. Caroline exhaled sharply. Where's Ali? David hesitated. He's holding a press conference tomorrow morning. Caroline's gaze sharpened. About what? David's expression hardened. About you. Caroline's jaw clenched. Then we beat him to it. David's brow furrowed. How? Caroline stepped toward him, her gaze burning. We expose the rest of the network. David's eyes widened. Caroline, that's dangerous. So is losing. Caroline replied. David shook his head. We don't have enough evidence yet. Caroline's gaze sharpened. Then we get more. The next morning, Caroline walked into the Capitol with the full weight of Washington pressing down on her shoulders. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions as she pushed through the crowd. Congresswoman Leavitt, are you being investigated for corruption? Congresswoman, did you falsify evidence? Are you colluding with foreign governments? Caroline stopped at the top of the marble steps. She turned toward the cameras, her expression sharp and cold. The American people know exactly who's corrupt here, Caroline said, her voice cut through the noise like a whip. And it's not me. A reporter called out. Judge Ali is accusing you of political sabotage. Caroline's gaze sharpened. Then he should come say it to my face. An hour later, Caroline was seated in the Intelligence Committee's private chamber. The room was empty except for David and a single briefcase sitting on the table. David unlocked the briefcase and slid a file toward her. This is what we have, David said. Caroline opened the file. Inside were transcripts of phone calls, internal memos, and financial transfers, direct evidence linking Judge Amir Ali, Justice Barrett, and 2 senior defense contractors to foreign governments. Caroline's breath sharpened. This is enough. David's gaze darkened. To take down Barrett? Caroline's eyes burned. To take down the whole damn court. David hesitated. You realize what this will mean? Caroline's jaw tightened. It means they finally pay. David's eyes sharpened. Then let's finish this. Caroline's smile was cold. Schedule the hearing. David stood. You want it public? Caroline's gaze was hard as steel. Very public. That night, Caroline sat alone in the darkness of the safe house. A single lamp cast flickering light across the stack of documents in front of her. The truth was there, in black and white: money, power, influence. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up without checking the screen. You should have stopped, a distorted voice said on the other end. Caroline's pulse quickened. Too late. You don't understand what you're playing with, the voice said. Caroline's gaze sharpened. And you don't understand who you're dealing with. The line went dead. Caroline leaned back in her chair, her gaze burning. They thought they could scare her. They were wrong. Caroline stood in the marble hallway outside the Intelligence Committee's chamber, the echo of her heels sharp against the polished floor. The atmosphere was electric. Reporters gathered at the far end of the hall. Security lined the perimeter, and the buzz of political anticipation hung thick in the air. David adjusted his tie beside her, his expression dark and focused. They're already inside, he said. All of them? Caroline asked. David nodded. Ali, Barrett, the Chief Justice. Half the Senate is watching this live. Caroline's gaze hardened. Good. David leaned in. Caroline, this is the moment. If you screw this up, I'm not going to screw it up, Caroline said. David's mouth pressed into a thin line. It's not just your career on the line anymore. If they decide you've overstepped, I don't care about my career, Caroline said sharply. David studied her for a moment, then nodded. Then let's finish this. The heavy oak doors to the hearing room swung open. Caroline stepped through, her head held high as the noise of the room dropped into a tense, expectant silence. Amir Ali sat at the witness table, dressed in a tailored gray suit, his expression cool and calculating. Amy Coney Barrett sat behind him, her gaze steady and remote. The Chief Justice sat at the center of the panel, his hands clasped in front of him, his face as impassive as stone. Caroline took her seat across from Ali, unfolding a stack of neatly organized documents in front of her. Judge Ali, Caroline began, her tone measured. Thank you for joining us today. Ali inclined his head slightly. Of course, Congresswoman. I understand you've made some serious allegations against me, Caroline said. Ali's smile didn't reach his eyes. I've simply raised concerns about the legality of the information you released to the press. You mean the information proving that you and Justice Barrett were compromised by foreign-backed lobbyists? Ali's jaw tightened. The source of that information is under question. Caroline leaned back slightly. And what about the substance of it? Ali's eyes darkened. That's a matter for the court. Caroline's smile sharpened. That's convenient. Ali's gaze remained cold. If you're suggesting that I'm not suggesting anything, Caroline interrupted. I'm stating it outright. She opened the file in front of her and held up a document. This, Caroline said, is a record of a financial transfer made through a shell company based in the Cayman Islands. The account belongs to a defense contractor linked to foreign governments. That same contractor made a donation to a lobbying firm connected to your confirmation process. Ali's expression didn't change. That's circumstantial. Caroline's gaze sharpened. Is it? She held up another document. This, she said, is a record of a private meeting between you, Justice Barrett, and the CEO of that defense contractor, 2 weeks before the Supreme Court ruling. A murmur ran through the chamber. Ali's eyes flashed with brief irritation. And this, Caroline said, lifting another paper, is the direct transcript of a conversation between the defense contractor and a senior advisor to a foreign government, referencing your ruling before it was even made. Ali's jaw tightened. Caroline's gaze burned. That's not circumstantial. That's corruption. Ali's mask slipped for half a second, a flash of vulnerability beneath the controlled exterior. The Chief Justice's gaze darkened. Judge Ali, do you care to respond? Allie's expression hardened. This is a political attack. Caroline's smile was cold. The facts aren't political. Allie leaned forward. The judiciary is not subject to the whims of Congress. Caroline's gaze sharpened. When the judiciary is compromised, it becomes the duty of Congress to intervene. Allie's eyes narrowed. Be careful, Congresswoman. Caroline's smile sharpened. That's the second time I've been told that this week. Allie's jaw tightened. Caroline set down the papers in front of her. Judge Allie, let me ask you a simple question. Did you receive compensation, directly or indirectly, from any foreign entity prior to issuing your ruling? Allie's gaze was like ice. I have no further comment. I'll take that as a yes. The chamber exploded into noise, reporters shouting questions, senators murmuring to each other. The Chief Justice slammed his gavel. Order. Allie's expression was taut. Barrett's gaze sharpened, her eyes flashing with quiet calculation. Caroline leaned forward. You think you're untouchable. You think the system will protect you. But here's the truth, Judge Allie. The American people are watching now. And they won't forget. Allie's jaw tightened. Caroline stood. This hearing is adjourned. She walked toward the exit, the echo of her heels cutting through the din of voices behind her. Outside the chamber, David was waiting. His expression was hard, but there was a flicker of pride beneath it. You got him, David said. Caroline's gaze was sharp. Not yet. David's brows lifted. What's next? Caroline's smile was dangerous. Barrett. That evening, Caroline sat alone in her office. The city lights glittered through the windows. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She picked it up. You made a mistake. It was Holloway's voice. Caroline's jaw tightened. Did I? You pushed too hard. Holloway said. Allie will resign. But Barrett. She's next. Caroline interrupted. Holloway's voice sharpened. Careful, Levitt. Barrett isn't Allie. I know exactly what she is. Holloway's voice dropped. You've started a war you can't win. Caroline's gaze hardened. That's where you're wrong. Then you'd better be ready. Holloway said. Because Barrett's not going down without a fight. The line went dead. Caroline stared out the window at the city below. Her reflection stared back at her. Hard and determined. Let them come. The following morning, Caroline's office was flooded with media requests. Reporters were stationed outside the Capitol. Social media was ablaze with speculation. And then, late that afternoon, a single statement was released from the Supreme Court. Justice Amir Ali has resigned. Effective immediately. David walked into her office, holding his phone. His eyes were wide. They forced him out, David said. Caroline's gaze sharpened. Good. David hesitated, but Barrett's not stepping down. Caroline smiled faintly. She won't. David's eyes narrowed. So what's the plan? Caroline's gaze darkened. We take it to the court. That night, Caroline's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. She answered. A woman's voice, low and steady, came through the line. You've made a lot of enemies, Congresswoman. Caroline's pulse quickened. And you've made one very dangerous one. Caroline's smile was cold. Then they should be worried. The woman's voice sharpened. Barrett is not your average opponent. Caroline's gaze darkened. Neither am I. The line went dead. Caroline's gaze sharpened. Barrett was next. And this time, Caroline wasn't going to stop until the whole corrupt system came crashing down. Caroline stood at the edge of the Supreme Court steps, the chill of the early morning cutting through the thin fabric of her coat. Behind her, the great marble columns of the court loomed large and imposing. In front of her, a sea of reporters and television cameras waited, their lenses focused. Microphones extended, ready to broadcast her next words to the entire nation. David stood at her side, his gaze scanning the crowd with quiet intensity. He leaned toward her. Are you sure about this? Caroline's gaze sharpened. Completely. David's expression darkened. Once you say this out loud, you can't take it back. I'm not planning to. A hush fell over the crowd as Caroline stepped toward the microphone. She set a thick folder of documents on the podium in front of her, the weight of it landing with a dull thud. My fellow Americans, she began, her voice cutting through the cold air. You've been lied to. The crowd tensed. For too long, the highest court in our land has been compromised. Not by bad law, but by corruption. Murmurs rippled through the reporters. Cameras flashed. I stood before you weeks ago and told you the truth about Judge Amir Ali. Caroline continued, that he was compromised, that he was influenced by foreign interests. Her gaze sharpened. And now, I'm here to tell you it wasn't just him. A sudden rush of noise, reporters shouting questions. Microphones angled closer. Caroline's gaze burned into the crowd. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, Caroline said, knowingly and deliberately betrayed the American people. She aligned herself with the same foreign-backed defense contractors that compromised Judge Ali. She allowed outside interests to influence her decisions, not in the interest of the American people, but in the interest of wealth and power. The crowd erupted. Questions flew toward her like bullets. Caroline's voice rose over the noise. Barrett sat on that bench knowing that her decision would send billions of taxpayer dollars overseas, even as Americans were struggling to survive. And why? She opened the folder in front of her and held up a document. Because 2 months before her ruling, Caroline said, Barrett's husband accepted a position on the board of a defense contractor directly linked to the ruling. And that same defense contractor is tied to foreign governments with a financial stake in the outcome. David's breath hitched beside her. Caroline held up another paper. This is the financial record, she said. Barrett's husband's contract was worth $2.5 million, paid directly through a shell company designed to conceal its origin. Reporters gasped. Caroline's gaze sharpened. Justice Barrett knew exactly what she was doing. She put foreign interests ahead of the American people. And today, I am calling for her immediate resignation from the Supreme Court. The crowd exploded. David's hand brushed her shoulder. Here we go. Caroline's gaze didn't waver. I am also calling for a full congressional investigation into the financial ties between the Supreme Court and foreign entities. Caroline continued, and I am urging Congress to pass legislation to ensure that our judiciary remains independent and accountable to the people. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Congresswoman, have you spoken to Justice Barrett directly? Do you expect the White House to support your call for resignation? Do you think Barrett will retaliate? Caroline's gaze hardened. It doesn't matter what Barrett does. She stepped away from the microphone. What matters is that the American people now know the truth. She turned and walked down the steps. David at her side. David's jaw tightened. She's not going to resign. Caroline smiled faintly. No, but she's going to bleed. The next day, Justice Barrett stood before a private panel of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Her face was composed, but her eyes burned with barely concealed anger. The cameras were off, but the room was filled with senators and legal advisors, all waiting for her explanation. You've been accused of corruption, Senator Vance said coldly. Barrett's gaze sharpened. The accusations are politically motivated. Vance's gaze darkened. The financial records are real. Barrett's jaw tightened. Coincidence? Vance leaned forward. Did you speak with the defense contractor directly before your ruling? Barrett's silence was loud enough to fill the room. Justice Barrett, Vance pressed. Did you use your position on the Supreme Court to benefit a foreign government? Barrett's gaze hardened. I have no further comment. Vance's expression darkened. He turned toward the panel. I believe that tells us everything we need to know. Barrett stood slowly, her gaze cutting through the room. You think you've won? Vance's gaze was cold. You're not walking away from this. Barrett's smile didn't reach her eyes. I'm not walking away. You can't remove me. Vance's gaze sharpened. We'll see. 1 week later, Caroline sat at her desk, watching the television screen in silence. The news anchor's voice was calm but tense. Breaking news from Washington. Justice Amy Coney Barrett has announced her resignation from the Supreme Court. Citing personal reasons, sources within the White House confirm that pressure from Congress and the threat of an impeachment trial led to the decision. David sat across from her. You did it. Caroline's gaze sharpened. We did it. David hesitated. And the Chief Justice? Caroline's gaze darkened. He's next. David exhaled. Caroline, this isn't over. You just reshaped the court. You changed the balance of power. They're not going to let that stand. Caroline's lips curled into a faint smile. Let them try. David hesitated. And what happens now? Caroline leaned back, her gaze steady. Now we rebuild. David's eyes narrowed. And who controls the rebuild? Caroline's gaze sharpened. We do. 6 months later, Caroline stood on the steps of the Capitol. the morning sun casting long shadows across the marble steps. Behind her, the new nominees for the Supreme Court stood side by side, carefully vetted. Carefully chosen. The president stepped forward, standing beside her. Reporters were lined up along the barricades. The anticipation palpable. Caroline adjusted the microphone. "My fellow Americans," she began, "today marks the beginning of a new era." She glanced toward the nominees. Faces representing both parties. Diverse, young, and untainted by political loyalty. For too long, the system served itself. Caroline said, "Not anymore. Today, we restore power to the people." The crowd erupted into cheers. David stood beside her, his gaze steady. "This is bigger than you, Caroline." "I know." David's eyes narrowed. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Caroline smiled faintly. "I was born ready." David's gaze sharpened. "And the establishment?" Caroline's smile faded. "They'll push back." David's mouth tightened. "And when they do?" Caroline's gaze was cold. "Then we push harder." She stepped back from the microphone as the crowd roared. Caroline Leavitt had done the impossible. She had taken down a corrupt system, rebuilt it from the ground up, and in doing so, she had become more than just a politician. She had become a force. And this was only the beginning.